The moment Susanna Mercer stepped off the train at Caldwell, Kansas, in the spring of 1882, she opened her mouth and changed the entire course of her life, though she did not know it yet. The platform was thick with dust and noise, men calling out to each other across the yard, horses tied to posts stamping their hooves against the dry earth, and somewhere behind the depot a dog barking at nothing in particular. The afternoon sun hung low and merciless over the flat prairie, baking the wooden planks of the platform until they radiated heat like a stove. Susanna stood at the top of the iron steps with her carpet bag in one hand and her small leather traveling trunk balanced on the step below her, and she looked out over Caldwell, Kansas, and said, loudly enough for the nearest dozen people to hear, "Well, this is considerably worse than advertised." There was a silence that lasted about 2 full heartbeats. Then a man named Hector Prout, who was standing at the far end of the platform holding a hand-lettered sign with the name Mercer painted on it in uneven black letters, turned a shade of red that competed admirably with the setting sun. He was a man of perhaps 50, thick in the middle, with a drooping gray mustache and the general bearing of someone who had not expected to be embarrassed this afternoon and was finding the experience unpleasant. Hector Prout had placed the advertisement in the St. Louis Gazette himself. He had described himself as a prosperous rancher of good standing, widowed, of sound health and sober habits, seeking a capable woman of breeding and refinement to manage his household and share his home. He had described his property as one of the finest holdings in Caldwell, with a proper house, a working well, and a garden already established. He had not mentioned that the garden was mostly dead, that the house needed significant work, or that Caldwell, while a growing and respectable cattle town, was not precisely the cultivated environment a woman from St. Louis might envision. Susanna descended the remaining steps with the kind of dignity that suggested she was fully aware of the impression she was making and had decided to make it anyway. She was 26 years old, with dark chestnut hair pinned up under a traveling hat that was slightly wilted from the journey, sharp gray eyes that missed very little, and a figure that was trim and straight as a fence post. She wore a practical gray traveling dress with a small bustle, which was already attracting a fine coating of Kansas dust, and her expression was one of a woman taking inventory. "Mr. Prout, I presume," she said, stopping in front of the man with the sign. "Miss Mercer," he said, and his voice had a stiffness to it that suggested he was reconsidering a number of decisions simultaneously. "I note that your advertisement mentioned established gardens," Susanna said pleasantly. "I have seen the outskirts of this town from the train window, and I wonder if perhaps you were using the word established in a somewhat optimistic fashion." "It has been a dry spring," Hector Prout said. "It has been a dry decade by the look of things," Susanna replied, and she bent to pick up one handle of her trunk. That was the moment Luke Graves decided not to leave. He had been on his way to the livery stable, which was at the far end of the street past the depot. He had his horse, a bay gelding named Cutter, tied to the rail outside the station, and he had come to collect a saddle bag he had left for repair at the tack shop next door. And he had absolutely no reason to be standing on the platform listening to a woman he had never met take systematic inventory of Hector Prout's shortcomings. He had been told by his employer, a rancher named Douglas Kane who ran the Double C spread 12 miles east of town, to collect the saddle bag, pick up supplies from the general store, and get back before dark. He had a full afternoon of work waiting for him, and yet he stayed. Luke Graves was 29 years old, lean and broad-shouldered, with dark hair that wanted cutting and green eyes that were more accustomed to watching the horizon than watching people. He had come to Caldwell from Texas 4 years earlier, following work up the cattle trail and eventually finding steady employment with Douglas Kane, who paid fair wages and did not ask too many questions about a man's past. He was not the type to involve himself in other people's business. He was not the type to linger on train platforms. He was especially not the type to find himself standing very still with his hat in his hand, watching a woman he had never seen before tell Hector Prout uncomfortable truths, and feel something shift quietly in the center of his chest like a door opening that he had not known was closed. She was trying to lift the trunk herself, and Prout was making no move to help her, and that, at least, gave Luke a reason to cross the platform. "Let me get that for you, ma'am," he said. Susanna looked up at him. Her gray eyes were direct and completely unimpressed, which Luke found immediately and irrationally encouraging. "Thank you," she said. "It is heavier than it looks. I packed books." "Books," Hector Prout said, as though she had said something mildly alarming. "Yes," Susanna said, turning back to her intended. "Books. I read them. I also write letters, maintain opinions, and occasionally speak them aloud. I did mention this in my correspondence, Mr. Prout, though I understand if you chose to overlook certain details." Hector Prout looked at Luke Graves, and then at Susanna Mercer, and then back at Luke Graves, and his expression cycled through several things before settling into something flat and resigned. "Miss Mercer," he said, with the careful tone of a man dismantling something before it could explode, "I wonder if perhaps this arrangement was formed under certain misapprehensions on both sides." Susanna tilted her head. "Are you suggesting that you would like to reconsider?" "I am suggesting," Hector Prout said carefully, "that you seem to be a fine woman but perhaps not ideally suited to the particular requirements of running a cattle ranch household." "What you mean to say," Susanna said, and her voice was perfectly even, "is that you wanted a woman who would not notice that the gardens are dead, the house needs work, and your advertisement contained several significant embellishments." The silence that followed this was the loudest Luke had heard in some time. "I will arrange for the return of your passage costs," Prout said at last. Susanna stood very still for a moment. Luke, holding her trunk, watched her face and saw something move across it, quick and complicated, before she put it away behind a composed expression. He recognized that look. It was the look of someone absorbing a blow they had been halfway expecting. "That is acceptable," she said quietly. Prout gave a curt nod, turned, and walked off the platform with the relieved stride of a man who felt he had gotten away with something. Which, Luke thought, watching him go, he had. He had placed an advertisement with embellishments designed to attract a capable woman, had brought her across most of the state of Missouri and well into Kansas, and had then used her honest tongue as an excuse to back out of an arrangement he may have been uncertain about from the beginning. It was not illegal, but it was not especially honorable either. Luke turned back to Susanna. She was looking out at the street beyond the platform, at the wooden storefronts and the horses tied in rows and the men going about their afternoon business, and her jaw was set in a particular way that said she was not going to let anyone see her be shaken. "Where are you headed, ma'am?" he asked. "Apparently back to St. Louis," she said, and there was a dry humor in it that did not quite hide the frustration underneath. "Train does not go back until Thursday," Luke said. Susanna turned to look at him fully then. "Today is Monday." "Yes, ma'am." She looked at the street again. "Is there a respectable boarding house in this town?" "Mrs. Clara Holt runs a clean establishment on the 2nd Street over," Luke said. "Reasonable rates, good meals. She takes in travelers and doesn't ask unnecessary questions." Susanna glanced at him sideways. "You seem very familiar with the amenities of Caldwell for a man who happened to be passing through." "I work the Double C," Luke said. 12 miles east. I come in for supplies most weeks." "A cowboy," she said. "Yes, ma'am." "That explains it," she said, though she did not specify what it explained. She reached into her small traveling bag and withdrew a coin purse. "What do I owe you for carrying the trunk?" "Nothing," Luke said. She looked at him steadily. "I do not accept charity." "It was not charity," he said. "It was just carrying a trunk. Any decent man would have done it." She put the coin purse away without further argument, which told him she was practical enough to know when to stop pressing a point. "Well then," she said, "will you point me toward Mrs. Holt's establishment, or shall I ask someone else?" Luke picked up the trunk properly and nodded down the main street. "I will walk you there," he said. "It is on my way." It was not precisely on his way to the livery, but that seemed less important than it had 15 minutes ago. They walked along the main street of Caldwell together, which drew some glances from the men on the sidewalk and from the women on the opposite side, though Susanna appeared entirely untroubled by this. The town was busy with the beginning of the cattle drive season. Drovers from Texas were beginning to arrive, filtering up through Indian Territory with their longhorn herds, and Caldwell was positioned at the head of the Kishom Trail, which made it one of the most active cattle shipping points on the Kansas border. The streets had energy and noise, and the smell of cattle and horses and dust was settled into everything. "Is it always like this?" Susanna asked, watching a group of trail-worn cowboys lope past on tired horses. "Worse in summer," Luke said. "Cattle season is just getting started." She said, and he could not quite tell if she was appalled or interested. "You are from St. Louis," he said. "Born and raised," she said. "My father was a school teacher. My mother passed 8 years ago. Father passed last autumn." She said the last part matter-of-factly, but he heard what was under it. "I had been teaching school myself, but the position was taken by a man when the term ended, which is the custom when a man wants it. I had some savings." The advertisement seemed like a reasonable solution to several problems at once. "I am sorry about your father," Luke said. She glanced at him. "Thank you, he was a good man. He would have found this town extremely interesting." "And you?" She was quiet for a moment, looking up the street. "I have not decided yet," she said finally. That honesty, Luke thought, was worth considerably more than most of what people said. They reached Mrs. Holt's boarding house, a wide 2-story building painted white with green shutters, with a modest sign by the door and a porch swing that was occupied by an elderly man smoking a pipe and reading a newspaper. Luke set the trunk down on the porch steps and turned to face Susanna, who was already pulling herself up straight with the particular energy of a person getting ready to manage a new situation. "Thank you, Mr." She paused. "Graves," he said. "Luke Graves." "Mr. Graves," she said. "You have been very kind." She went up the steps and knocked at the door, and Luke stood there for a moment longer than was strictly necessary, hat in hand, while the afternoon sun threw long shadows across the porch. And then he turned and walked back up the street toward the tack shop, and then the general store and eventually the livery, telling himself with each step that he had done his good deed for the day, and that was the end of it. He was still thinking about the way she had said this is considerably worse than advertised, and the look on her face when Pruitt had walked away. When he climbed into the saddle 2 hours later and headed east toward the Double C. Cutter flicked his ears back and then forward in that easy way he had, and the prairie spread out around them in the golden light, and Luke rode for about 4 miles before he admitted to himself, with the complete privacy of a man alone on a horse in the middle of the Kansas grassland, that he fully intended to go back to Caldwell the following day and see if she was still there. She was still there. She was, in fact, standing on the sidewalk outside the general store the next morning at 10 o'clock, engaged in what appeared to be a very direct conversation with the store's proprietor, a man named Gideon Walsh, who had the look of someone being politely but firmly educated about something he had not anticipated being educated about. Luke came in from the East Road and tied Cutter at the rail nearest the store and leaned against the post with the ease of a man who just happened to be there. "The price on the writing paper is not what the placard says," Susanna was saying to Gideon Walsh in a perfectly pleasant tone. "Well, now the placard is for the cheaper grade," Walsh said, looking uncomfortable. "The placard does not specify grade," Susanna said. "It says writing paper, 2 cents a sheet. You charged me 4 cents. Walsh looked past Susanna, caught sight of Luke, and his expression shifted into something between relief and sheepishness. "Miss," he said, "now I have always run an honest store, then an honest store would honor the posted price," Susanna said. Walsh dug in his apron pocket, retrieved 2 pennies, and handed them over. Susanna accepted them with a gracious nod and turned to go, and found Luke standing at the edge of the sidewalk. She looked at him without particular surprise, which he liked. "Mr. Graves," she said. "Miss Mercer," he said. "Morning." "Is it customary?" she asked, falling into step beside him with a naturalness that suggested she had thought about this no more than he had, for cowboys to be in town on a Tuesday morning. "I come in for supplies twice a week," Luke said, which was not entirely inaccurate, though the schedule was generally more flexible than that. She seemed to accept this. They walked together without any particular destination, which was slightly unusual and also felt entirely natural, and Luke noticed that she looked at everything with that same sharp, cataloging attention she had given the town from the train window. "What do you think of it now?" he asked. "Now that you have had a night to look at it." Susanna was quiet for a moment. "It is rougher than I expected," she said. "And louder. But there is something—" She stopped, tilting her head slightly as if listening. "There is something here that St. Louis does not have. Room. I cannot explain it better than that. In St. Louis everything was already decided. Every street, every building, every position a person might occupy. Here it feels like decisions are still being made." "That is a fair description," Luke said. "On the other hand," she said, "I saw two men disputing something in the street at 8 this morning that appeared to be settled by one of them throwing a boot at the other, which seems less than civilized." Luke laughed. It was an involuntary sound, and she looked at him with something that was not quite a smile but was clearly in the neighborhood of one. "That would be the Dibbs brothers," he said. "They dispute everything. They threw things at each other last week over a horse blanket. No one has been killed yet." "How reassuring," she said, and this time the smile arrived, small and dry and absolutely genuine, and Luke felt the door in his chest swing a little wider and let in more light. They stopped at the edge of the main street, where it opened out to the broad flat of the prairie beyond the last buildings. "I have been thinking," Susanna said, looking out at the horizon, "about what to do until Thursday." "What have you concluded?" "I am considering not going back," she said, and she said it the way a person announces something they have been working up to, letting the words sit and see how they feel in the open air. "St. Louis has nothing pressing waiting for me. I have some savings, enough to sustain myself for some months if I am careful. Mrs. Holt says there may be need for a schoolteacher in the fall, as the county is discussing building a proper schoolhouse. I could look into that." Luke kept his face neutral. "That sounds like a reasonable plan." She turned to look at him. Her gray eyes were direct as always, and now they had something in them that might have been a question or might have been the beginning of an answer. "Tell me about the Double C," she said. "What is that like?" Luke thought about Douglas Kane and the ranch, about the wide fields of grass and the good water from the creek, about the bunkhouse and the work and the life of it. "It is a well-run spread," he said. "Douglas Kane is a fair employer. Good land, good cattle. We run a mixed herd, mostly longhorns, but Kane has been crossing in some Herefords to improve the beef quality. There is a real house cook named Abigail, 3 permanent hands and usually 2 or 3 seasonal. It is honest work." "Do you like it?" she asked. He considered that. "I like the land," he said. "I like the horses. I like the work well enough. It is a good life." "But," she said, hearing something, he looked at her. "I have been thinking about having my own land," he said. "I have been saving. There is a section east of here about 20 miles, good water, good grass. A man could build something on it." "Then why haven't you?" "Takes time," he said. "And it helps to know you are building it for something, not just towards something." There was a silence after that, not uncomfortable, more like the silence after a statement that neither person is ready to answer yet. Susanna straightened her hat against a gust of Kansas wind. "I am going to write some letters this afternoon," she said. "Inquiries about the school position. I thought you should know." "I am glad to know it," Luke said. She nodded, gave him a small direct look, and headed back up the main street. Luke stood at the edge of the town and the prairie and watched her go, and then he turned to look east, out over the flat grass rolling away toward his employer's land, and beyond that to where his own land might someday be, and he felt for the first time in a long while that the horizon looked less like empty distance and more like the direction of something worth going toward. He came back on Thursday. He told himself it was for additional supplies. He came back on Saturday with a pair of horses he was delivering to the livery. He came back on the following Tuesday because Mrs. Holt had sent word through a passing drover that a letter had arrived for him at the post office, which was unusual enough to be worth investigating in person. Even though the letter turned out to be a tax notice for land back in Texas, he had sold 2 years prior that the county had not gotten around to clearing from their rolls. But on each of these days, he found Susanna, and on each of these days they walked the streets of Caldwell together and talked, and the conversations were never the same twice. She told him about St. Louis, about her father's schoolroom with the big windows and the smell of chalk, and the particular satisfaction of watching a child's face change when something became clear to them. He told her about Texas, about learning to ride before he learned to read, about his mother who had died when he was 12 and his father who had been a good man but a tired one, who had given Luke his horse and his saddle and his blessing at 17, and set him loose on the world without much ceremony. She told him about the way the city seemed to move faster every year, the new buildings going up, the streetcars, the gas lights, and the feeling she had sometimes of being a person from an earlier time who had been deposited into someone else's future. He told her about the way the Kansas sky looked at 4 in the morning, before the sun came up, when it was the deepest blue-black he had ever seen, and the stars were so thick they looked solid. She listened the way she did everything, with complete and focused attention, and when she disagreed with him she said so, and when she agreed she said that too, and he found that both were equally satisfying because they were both equally genuine. In the second week of May, the school board held a meeting at the town hall and invited her to make her case for the teaching position, and she came to the meeting with her credentials written out clearly on paper and presented them to 5 men who ranged from genuinely interested to visibly skeptical, and she answered every question with the same direct patience she applied to everything, and she was offered the position provisionally, to begin when the schoolhouse was completed in late summer. The pay was modest. She accepted it without complaint and thanked the board members by name, and came out of the meeting looking as close to elated as he had ever seen her, which manifested primarily as a very slight flush in her cheeks and a brightness in her eyes, and the fact that she walked more quickly than usual. Luke was waiting outside. He had offered to drive her to the meeting in the Double C's wagon, which Douglas Kane had loaned him for the day, along with a knowing look that Luke had chosen to ignore. "Well," he said. "Provisionally hired," she said. He smiled. It was a full smile, and he did not try to moderate it, and she stopped walking for a half-second when she saw it, which he filed away privately. "Congratulations, Miss Mercer," he said. "Susanna," she said. "We have been walking this town together for 2 weeks. You may call me Susanna." "Susanna," he said, and she said Luke, and there it was, his name in her voice, and it settled somewhere in him like a nail being driven home. They drove back toward Mrs. Holt's in the wagon, with the late afternoon laying gold across the wide Kansas plain, and the meadowlarks calling from the fence posts, and Luke was aware in a way that was both clear and slightly alarming that he was the happiest he had been in several years. "I need to ask you something," Susanna said when they were halfway down the main street. "Ask," he said. She looked at the road ahead, hands folded in her lap. "Do you come into town this often as a general matter, or have you been coming in because of me?" There it was. He had known it was coming. He glanced at her. She was looking straight ahead, but there was a tension in her shoulders that suggested the answer mattered. "Because of you," he said. "Mostly," she nodded, still looking ahead. "That is what I thought," she said. "I wanted to know if I was correct. And now that you are—" "I do not know yet," she said honestly. "I came here to marry a man I had never met, which seems in retrospect to have been a reasonably optimistic approach to life. I had a plan, and the plan collapsed on the train platform, and I am trying to construct a new one. I do not want to build it on assumptions." "That is fair," he said. "But," she said, and turned to look at him, and the direct gray eyes were not quite as certain as usual, which was somehow more affecting than her certainty. "I would like very much for you to keep coming into town, if you want to." "I want to," Luke said. She turned back to the road, and he saw her let out a slow breath, and she was smiling at the road. It was a small smile, and she was not performing it for anyone, and that was why it was the most beautiful thing he had seen in his life so far. The months that followed were the sweetest he could remember. Luke came to Caldwell 3 times a week through the remainder of May and all of June. He came for the Saturday evening gatherings at the church hall, where the town's families put out food and someone usually played a fiddle, and the long Kansas evenings were spent in the kind of sociable ease that frontier communities produced out of necessity and then came to love. He sat beside Susanna at these evenings, and she told him things, and he told her things, and they argued pleasantly about whether Kansas was better or worse than Missouri for farming, and about whether Douglas Kane's decision to keep Longhorns was going to be a lasting advantage or a passed-over opportunity compared to the better beef cattle that Eastern buyers were beginning to prefer, and about whether the new schoolhouse should have 3 windows or 4 on the eastern wall for maximum morning light. He met her at the general store one Wednesday afternoon in June when a thunderstorm came rolling in off the plains, and they ducked into the store together, and then could not leave for nearly an hour, because the rain came down in solid gray sheets that turned the street to mud, and they stood in the warm smell of sawdust and coffee and dry goods and talked for the entire hour without noticing the time, and when the rain cleared and the street steamed in the renewed sunshine, Walsh, the storekeeper, cleared his throat and pointed out that they had been blocking his candy counter. They walked back to Mrs. Holt's through the mud-washed evening, and at the gate Susanna turned to face him, and he had been working himself up to say something for about 2 weeks, and he said it. "I would like to court you properly," he said. "I should have said it before this, but I am saying it now. I would like to take you to supper at the hotel dining room and come to call on you at Mrs. Holt's on Sundays, and I would like everyone to know that is what I am doing, if you are willing." She looked at him in the way she had of looking at things, steady and full. "I am willing," she said. And then, because she was Susanna Mercer and she did things directly and without unnecessary decoration, she reached up and put her hand against his jaw briefly, a gentle, deliberate touch, and said, "I am quite willing, Luke," and went inside, and he walked back down the street through the residual mud of the storm feeling something close to weightless. He told Douglas Kane about it that evening when he got back to the ranch. Kane was a man in his 50s, lean and sun-browned, who had built his spread from nothing and had strong opinions about cattle, horses, water rights, and the value of clear, plain speech. He was eating supper at the big table in the ranch house when Luke came in, and he looked at Luke's face and set down his fork. "Well," he said, "I am courting a woman in Caldwell," Luke said. "I know," Douglas Kane said. "I have been lending you my wagon twice a week for 2 months. She came on the train as a mail-order bride," Luke said. "The man backed out on the platform." Kane picked his fork back up. "His loss. She is a school teacher," Luke said. "She starts in late summer when the schoolhouse is done. She is the most direct person I have ever met in my life." Kane chewed thoughtfully. "I always liked direct people," he said. "Less wasted time." Luke sat down across the table. "I have been thinking about that land section east of the Walnut Creek Divide," he said. Kane looked at him over his coffee cup. "Thinking about buying it." "Yes, you have been saving for it." "I have enough," Luke said. "Nearly by fall I would have enough." Kane set the cup down. "You are a good hand," he said. "You are the best horseman I have. I do not want to lose you." "I was not thinking about leaving the Double C," Luke said. "Not right away. I could work the land in the mornings and evenings and on my days off, get it started, get a house up. That would take a year or 2. I could keep working for you through it." Kane thought about this for a while in the way he thought about everything, which was thoroughly and without rush. "All right," he said, "and when the place is running." "Then I work my own land," Luke said. Kane nodded. "That is how it should go," he said. "A man should have his own land." He looked at the window at the dark prairie beyond the glass. "I would expect you to give me proper notice and help me find a replacement." "Of course. And I would want to meet this woman." "I intend to bring her out here," Luke said. "On Sunday if she will come. Bring her for Sunday dinner," Kane said. "Abigail is making a roast." Luke smiled. "Thank you, Douglas." "Do not thank me," Kane said. "If she is half as capable as you seem to think, she is the one doing me the favor by not leaving Kansas." Susanna came to the Double C that Sunday in the church dress she had made herself, which was a deep blue that matched the Kansas sky at mid-morning, and she sat at Douglas Kane's table and listened to him talk about cattle breeds and water rights and the politics of the Kansas cattle trade. And she asked 12 questions that were so specific and well-reasoned that Kane answered every one of them with visible respect. And by the end of the meal he caught Luke's eye across the table and gave him a very slight nod that said, unambiguously, that she would do. After dinner Luke took her out to see the horses, because Susanna had admitted that she had ridden as a girl when her father had once kept a horse, and he saddled the gentlest of the ranch horses, a gray mare named Frances, and they rode out together in the afternoon light across the Double C's eastern range, with the grass moving in long waves around them and the sky enormous overhead. "I need to show you something," Luke said, when they had ridden about 2 miles. They crested a low rise in the land, and below them a creek ran through a stand of cottonwood trees, their leaves catching the light, and beyond the creek the land spread east in a long, gentle roll of good grass and dark soil. "That section," Luke said, "from the creek east to the tree line on the far side and north to that red rock outcropping up there, that is what I am buying." Susanna looked at it for a long time. The horse moved gently beneath her, and the wind moved through the cottonwoods and made a sound like water, and the afternoon was very still and very golden. "It is beautiful," she said quietly. "I thought so," Luke said. She turned to look at him. He was watching her watch the land, and neither of them was pretending not to know what this conversation was really about. "Luke," she said. "I am not asking anything yet," he said. "I want to be clear about that. I am showing you the land because you deserve to know what I am building toward. When I ask you something, and I intend to, I want you to know everything first. I want you to make an informed decision." Her eyes were doing that thing they sometimes did where the directness softened slightly into something more personal, more unguarded. "That is very thoughtful," she said. "I am trying to learn," he said. She laughed at that, a real laugh, warm and quick, and she shook her head and looked back at the land. "I could teach school in Caldwell," she said, half to herself. "It is only 20 miles. "It is a manageable distance," Luke said carefully. She looked at him sideways. "You said you were not asking anything yet." "I am not," he said. "I am just noting that the distance is manageable." She said, and the smile was back, small and private and completely lovely. They rode back in the long gold of the late afternoon, and Susanna Mercer sat in the wagon on the way back to Caldwell while Luke drove, and the horses moved at an easy pace, and she put her hand over his on the reins for a few minutes, not as a statement, not as a question, just as a fact, a simple and complete fact, and he turned his hand under hers and held it, and neither of them said a word about it for the entire ride back, though everything that needed to be said was said. In July the Kansas summer settled over Caldwell like a hot iron on cloth, and the cattle trade reached its peak pitch. The main street was packed daily with trail-worn drovers and buyers from the eastern packing houses, and there was money moving through the town in quantities that brought a certain kind of trouble with it. The saloons did their best business, and the sheriff, a steady man named Frank Alderton, had his hands full keeping the peace between Texas cowboys looking to blow off months of trail tension and local residents trying to maintain something like order. Susanna watched all of it with her historian's attention from the safe vantage of Mrs. Holt's porch or the walk to the general store, and she told Luke about it on his visits with the detached fascination of a scientist observing a specimen. 2 men were removed from the Silver Dollar Saloon this morning, she told him one Tuesday, and deposited in the middle of the street, and a horse had to detour around one of them. "Was anyone hurt?" Luke asked. "Only their dignity, and they did not seem to possess a great deal of it to begin with," she said. "Sheriff Alderton has been busy," Luke agreed. "I spoke to him this morning," she said. "He is a decent man. He told me the peak trouble period usually runs from late June through early August, and then things quiet significantly when the drives wind down. That is about right. I also spoke to Mrs. Alice Drummond," Susanna said, "who is on the school board. She has invited me to have supper with her family on Friday and discuss the curriculum. She was very kind." "Alice Drummond is a good woman," Luke said. "Her husband runs the hardware concern 2 streets over." "I know," Susanna said. "She told me." "She also told me that you are considered, by the general consensus of the town's female population, to be one of the more reliable and decent young men in the county, which she said is not as common a distinction as it ought to be." Luke looked at her. "Did she?" "She did," Susanna said, with perfect composure. "I told her I was inclined to agree, though I had not taken a formal survey." He reached over without ceremony and took her hand where it rested on the porch railing, and she let him, and they sat like that in the afternoon heat while Caldwell went about its summer business around them. In the 3rd week of July, there was trouble that was not the ordinary kind. A man named Rance Whitlow came to town with a group of drovers, and Whitlow was one of those men whose presence seemed to cool the air around him in an unpleasant way. He was large and broadly made, with a flat face and small pale eyes, and he had been refused service at Mrs. Holt's boarding house the previous year over a matter involving a broken window and an unpaid bill, and he had not forgotten this. He showed up at the boarding house on a Thursday evening when Luke was not in town, and he caused a commotion at the front door, demanding a room and being told with great composure by Mrs. Holt that she was fully occupied. Susanna happened to be at the top of the staircase when this occurred, and she heard Mrs. Holt's voice go tight in a particular way, and she came down. Whitlow was at the front door, one hand on the frame, leaning in, and Mrs. Holt was very still in the hallway with the particular stillness of someone who was frightened and not allowing themselves to show it. "Mrs. Holt," Susanna said from the staircase in her clearest voice, "has told you that she is fully occupied. That means there is no room here. I am certain the hotel on the main street has availability." Whitlow looked up at her. His pale eyes moved over her in a way that was deliberately unpleasant. "I was not talking to you," he said. "No," Susanna said, coming down the last few steps and positioning herself beside Mrs. Holt, "but I am talking to you. You were told the house is full. I suggest you take your business elsewhere before someone sends for Sheriff Alderton." Whitlow was the kind of man who needed to establish dominance in every room, and he stood for a moment, assessing, and Susanna did not look away from him or modulate her expression in any direction. "You have a sharp tongue," he said. "I have been told," she said. "Good night, sir." There was a long moment. Then Whitlow pulled his hand from the doorframe and stepped back, and the door closed, and Mrs. Holt let out a long, shaking breath. "Thank you, dear," she said. "Are you all right?" Susanna asked. "I am now," Clara Holt said. "He is a bad man. I should have sent for Frank Alderton before you came down." "You might send for him now," Susanna said. "He should know Whitlow is in town." Mrs. Holt did, and the sheriff spoke to Whitlow the following morning and made certain clear statements about the expectations of his jurisdiction, and Whitlow moved on with his drovers 2 days later without further incident. Luke came in on Saturday and heard about it from 2 separate people before he had been in town 20 minutes, and he found Susanna at the general store and stood in the door looking at her. "You handled Whitlow," he said. "Mrs. Holt handled Whitlow," Susanna said. "I just provided supplementary commentary." "Susanna," he said. She looked up from the shelf she was examining. "I was not reckless," she said. "I assessed the situation." He was the sort of man who backs down from direct confrontation when he cannot easily intimidate. Some men are like that. I was not alone, and there were other people in the street who would have heard if things had become alarming. "I should have been here," he said, and there was something in his voice that was not accusation but was not quite easy either. She put down what she was looking at and faced him. "Luke," she said, "I am capable. I know you are, but you wanted to be here." "Yes," he said. She looked at him steadily. "So did I," she said very quietly. "I would have very much preferred you to be here." He crossed the store in 3 steps and she did not move away, and he put both hands on either side of her face very gently and just held her like that for a moment, and she reached up and put her hands over his. "I am all right," she said. "I know," he said. "Good," she said, and her voice was not as steady as usual. He pressed his forehead to hers briefly, and they stood in the middle of the general store while Gideon Walsh made himself extremely busy at the other end of the counter. He bought land in August. The section east of the Walnut Creek Divide, the one he had shown Susanna from horseback in June, was owned by a man named Theodore Bush, who was moving his family to Colorado and was motivated to sell. Luke had been corresponding with Bush since April. He had his savings, which he had been building since arriving in Kansas, and Douglas Kane loaned him the remainder at no interest on a handshake agreement, which was the kind of transaction that still happened occasionally on the frontier and was worth more than most signed contracts. The deed was transferred at the county office on a Wednesday morning, and Luke walked out into the August heat holding it, and he stood on the courthouse steps and looked at the paper and felt something very specific and very quiet settle over him. He had land. He rode out to the section that afternoon, Cutter moving at an easy trot, and he walked the creek line and stood under the cottonwoods and looked at the space where he would build, and he thought about what it would look like with a house and a barn and horses in the pasture, and he thought about who he wanted to see moving through that picture, and the answer was as clear and fixed as the horizon. He had been building to this. He took 2 days to start clearing the building site, working with a couple of the Double C hands who had volunteered to help on their own time. On the 3rd day, a Sunday, he drove to Caldwell and arrived at Mrs. Holt's boarding house at 9 in the morning with his best hat and his cleanest shirt, and a bouquet of wildflowers he had cut from the south field at dawn, which had made the Double C hands look at each other with expressions that were carefully neutral and gave nothing away. Mrs. Holt opened the door, saw the flowers, and said, "I will fetch her immediately," and disappeared upstairs. Susanna came down in her blue dress, the Sunday one, and she stopped on the last step when she saw him standing in the hallway with the flowers, and something moved across her face that was tender and unguarded and completely unguarded. "Good morning," she said. "Good morning," he said. "I bought the land." She came the rest of the way down the stairs. "I know," she said. "Mrs. Drummond heard it from her husband, who heard it from the county clerk. This town has very efficient news distribution." "I have started clearing the building site," he said. "I know that too," she said. He held out the flowers. She took them and looked at them and then looked at him. "Susanna," he said. "Yes," she said. "I told you I would ask when you knew everything," he said. "You know the land, you know the work. You know I am a man who fixes fences before he fixes fences, if that makes any sense, and you know I am a man who will be working hard for several years before any of this looks like what I am intending it to look like." "It makes sense," she said, "and I know all of that. You have a teaching position and a life being built here on your own terms," he said, "and I want to be very clear that I am not asking you to give any of that up. I am asking if you want to build both of those things alongside mine." She was looking at him the way she looked at things that were important, with all of herself fully present and her gray eyes clear and direct. "Are you asking me to marry you, Luke Graves?" She said. "I am," he said. The pause that followed was about 3 seconds long, but he felt every fraction of it. "Yes," she said. "I am asking you too, if that helps." He laughed, bright and unexpected, and she laughed too, and he crossed the 2 steps between them, and she put her free hand against his chest, and he held her face again the way he had in the general store. Only this time he kissed her forehead, and then her cheek, and then, as she turned her face up to his, her mouth, and she kissed him back with the same directness she applied to everything, and it was, he thought, the single best thing that had ever happened to him. From the top of the staircase, there was a muffled but enthusiastic sound from Mrs. Holt, who had absolutely not been listening. "They married in September." The schoolhouse was completed in the last week of August, and Susanna began her teaching position the following Monday, arriving at the schoolhouse at 7:30 in the morning. With a list of supplies, she had compiled herself and opinions about the curriculum that she shared with the school board in writing, politely and thoroughly. And the board, which had by this point a fairly good understanding of what they had hired, largely agreed with her recommendations. The wedding was held at the church on the second Saturday of September, small and warm, with the congregation of Caldwell's most reliable families filling the pews and Douglas Kane standing up with Luke as his best man, which was an honor that visibly moved both of them, though neither of them said so directly. Mrs. Holt sat in the front row and cried happily into her handkerchief. Alice Drummond had organized a reception dinner in the church hall after the ceremony, and a fiddler played, and the Kansas evening light came through the windows in long amber bars, and it was one of those evenings that seemed to know it was worth remembering. Susanna walked down the aisle in a dress she had made with Mrs. Holt's help, cream-colored with small blue flowers embroidered at the collar, her chestnut hair dressed properly, and she walked with the characteristic directness that had announced itself the moment she stepped off the train on that May afternoon. And when she reached Luke at the altar, she looked at him and said, quietly enough that only he heard, "You are still here." "Still here," he confirmed. "Good," she said. They spoke their vows clearly and meant them. They moved into a temporary arrangement on the double C for the autumn and early winter, in a small additional room that Douglas Kane had cleared out with no ceremony and without being asked, while Luke worked on the house at the land section. Susanna rode to Caldwell for school Monday through Friday, and Luke went with her most mornings to leave her at the schoolhouse, and then rode east to the building site. And they met again in the afternoon and rode back together. And the double C hands found reasons to be busy looking at things in the middle distance on these return rides, because the sight of Luke and Susanna Graves coming back across the prairie in the evening was the sort of thing that made a person feel the world was operating correctly. The house went up through the autumn, with help from every available hand and from several men in Caldwell who came out on Saturdays to work, because that was how things were done in frontier communities when someone was building a proper house. Douglas Kane's carpenter, a methodical man named Ephraim, directed the framing. Luke worked beside him every hour he could spare. Susanna came on Saturdays and looked at the walls going up and made measured and reasonable suggestions about the interior layout, including the placement of windows for maximum morning light in the kitchen, which Ephraim accepted with professional respect. There was a moment in late October when the walls were up and the roof was being set, and Luke came to stand beside Susanna in the pale autumn sunshine while she looked at the rising house, her hands wrapped around a tin cup of coffee from the campfire Ephraim had going, and the cottonwoods along the creek had gone yellow and gold, and the grass was turning the color of dry honey, and she leaned her shoulder against his arm and he put his arm around her. "It is a good house," she said. "It will be," he agreed. "It already is," she said. He looked at her profile against the bright October sky, the focused face, the slight pleased curve of her mouth, and he thought, not for the first time and certainly not for the last, about Hector Prout standing on that train platform looking relieved, and how things had turned on a comment about dead gardens, and how he had been intending to walk past and had stayed to hear more, and had stayed and kept staying, and that it was possibly the single best failure of an errand he had ever accomplished. The house was finished in late November. They moved in on a cold, clear day when the prairie was iron brown and the sky was enormous and blue-white, and they carried their things inside together, Susanna's trunk with its books first, which Luke set down in the front room, and she unpacked with immediate industry while he built a fire in the new stone hearth. And the first evening in their own house was quiet and domestic and extraordinary. Abigail from the Double C had sent a covered pot of stew along as a moving-in gift, and they ate it at the table Luke had built himself, 2 mismatched chairs and a solid tabletop of good Douglas fir, and the fire crackled, and the Kansas wind moved against the new walls, and Susanna looked around the kitchen with its window catching the last of the twilight and said, "It is considerably better than advertised." And Luke, who had been drinking coffee and waiting, looked at her across the table, and she looked back at him, and they both started laughing at the same moment, the kind of laughter that comes from deep and easy happiness, and it filled the new house and made it theirs. She continued to teach. She was, by all accounts, an exceptional teacher, which surprised no one who had spoken to her for more than 5 minutes. She managed the schoolroom of 18 children ranging from 6 to 14 with a combination of genuine warmth, complete clarity about expectations, and a talent for making learning feel like something urgent and exciting rather than obligatory. The children adored her in the way children adore teachers who respect them. The parents respected her. The school board, after the first term, stopped qualifying her employment as provisional. Luke rode with her to Caldwell each morning and picked her up each afternoon, 5 days a week, rain or shine. In the worst weather he drove the wagon and tucked a good wool blanket around her legs, which she accepted without fuss, and which he considered one of the small pleasures of his daily life. He worked the land through the winter and into the spring. He had 10 horses by spring, including Cutter and 3 mares. He was working toward breeding, and he had fenced his main pasture and dug out the irrigation channel from the creek to his kitchen garden. And he had planted winter wheat in a small test field that came up bright green in the April sun and looked healthy. He was still working for Douglas Kane through this period, 3 days a week as they had agreed, and Kane accepted this with the equanimity of a man who had planned for it. The arrangement was working. On a morning in early April, Susanna told him she was expecting a child. She told him at breakfast, with the matter-of-fact directness of a woman who had been sitting with this information for a few days and had formed her thoughts about it. She told him, and then she looked at him to see what he would do with it. Luke put down his coffee cup and looked at her across the breakfast table and felt something open up inside him that he had not known was waiting. It was not surprise, exactly. It was more like recognition of something that had been moving toward him for a long time. "When," he said. "October, I think," she said. "Mrs. Holt agrees she has more experience with these things than I do." "Are you well?" he said. "Perfectly," she said. "Tired in the mornings, but otherwise fine. I intend to keep teaching through the summer and into the fall. I will let the school board know in good time." "Susanna," he said. "Luke," she said, watching him. He stood up from the table and came around to her side and crouched down to be at her level, and he took her hands in both of his. "Are you happy?" he said. "Not are you all right, not is everything fine, but the real question underneath both of those." She looked at him for a moment, the full look, all of herself in it, and said, "I am so happy I do not know precisely what to do with it." He pressed his lips to her knuckles, both hands, and held them there for a moment. "Good," he said, very quietly. "So am I," he told Douglas Kane that afternoon. Kane shook his hand and said he was going to be an excellent father, and then immediately suggested they get back to discussing the problem with the west fence line, which was Kane's way of showing emotion. Abigail, who overheard from the kitchen, came to the door and said she would teach Susanna everything she knew about childbirth, which she said with such confident authority that there was nothing to do but thank her. Word spread through Caldwell by the end of the week, because it always did, and Alice Drummond arrived at the schoolhouse the following Monday morning with a basket of knitted things and a face full of warm congratulation. And the mothers of Susanna's students stopped by the house over the following weeks with advice and gifts, and the easy generosity of women in a community who understood what it meant to be a long way from extended family. The summer passed in a fullness that Luke would remember always as one of the best seasons of his life. The wheat grew well, and the horses were doing beautifully, and Cutter had become the fastest cutting horse in the county, which Luke felt about with the specific pride a person feels towards something that has grown alongside them. Susanna taught her class through June, and then took her summer weeks to work in the kitchen garden, which she approached with the same focused determination she applied to everything, and which produced by August the most abundant vegetable garden on the section, including a remarkable quantity of corn and a tomato yield that impressed even Abigail. On a Saturday afternoon in late July, Luke found her sitting in the garden between two rows of corn, pulling weeds, and he came and crouched beside her and said, "You are supposed to be resting." "I am resting," she said, pulling a weed. "I am doing this sitting down." "Susanna, I am 4 months along, not ill," she said. "The doctor in Caldwell said exercise was beneficial." "He said gentle walks," Luke said. "Weeding is similar in principle," she said. He sat down in the dirt beside her, which made her look at him sideways. "What are you doing?" she said. "If you are weeding, I am weeding," he said, and started pulling the adjacent row. She looked at him for a moment with an expression that started as exasperation and arrived somewhere else entirely. "You are very difficult to argue with," she said. "I learned from you," he said. She laughed and went back to her weeding, and they worked the row together in the warm Kansas afternoon, while the corn stood tall around them, and the meadowlarks called from the fence posts, and the sky was the deep clear blue that only existed in this particular place at this particular time of year. And it was one of those moments where everything that had happened to bring them to this exact point seemed not accidental or unfortunate, but entirely necessary. Every disappointment and redirected plan a brick in the road to this garden, this afternoon, this man and this woman working together in the dirt. Their son was born in October. He came into the world on a Friday morning with full voice and considerable opinion, which Susanna said was perhaps predictable. Abigail delivered him with the confident expertise she had promised, and Mrs. Holt was there too, and Luke was nearby enough that he heard his son cry for the first time through the wall of the bedroom, and he sat down in the kitchen chair with his elbows on his knees and pressed both hands to his face and breathed through it for a minute. Abigail came through the door and said, "A boy, healthy and loud. Your wife is doing very well." Luke stood and went through the door, and Susanna was sitting up against the pillows, slightly worn in the way of a woman who had done a very significant physical thing, with a small wrapped bundle in her arms, and she looked up at him when he came in, and her face was something he had no words for, something entirely new and also entirely her, distilled to its pure essential nature. "Come here," she said. He sat on the edge of the bed, and she put the baby in his arms, and he looked at his son for the first time, the astonishing small face, the absolute realness of him, and he was completely overcome in a way he had not been prepared for, which in retrospect he should have been, because nothing had ever prepared him for any of the most important things that had happened to him in this life, and he had somehow gotten through them all right. "James," Susanna said, watching him hold their son. "I thought James." "After my father." "James," Luke said. His voice was rough. "James Graves." "James Henry Graves," Susanna said. "Henry was my father's middle name." Luke looked up at her, and she was watching him with the same directness she always had, but there was something more in it now, something added by the morning's work, by the fact of this boy, by the years of everything they had built together. "James Henry Graves," Luke said. "That is a good name." "I thought so," she said, and leaned her head against his shoulder. The three of them sat in the small October bedroom, while the Kansas morning moved through the window in clean, pale light, and the household went quietly on around them, and outside the horses moved in the pasture, and the cottonwoods along the creek dropped their last yellow leaves onto the dark water, and everything was exactly as it should be. James Graves was a forceful and cheerful baby, which were two qualities that seemed very right for the child of these two particular people. He had Luke's green eyes and Susanna's dark hair, and he approached every new discovery with an intensity that made Susanna laugh and Luke feel a specific kind of pride that he could not have explained to anyone who did not have children. Life organized itself around the new reality with the natural practicality that Susanna brought to everything. She returned to teaching in January because the school term needed her, and she needed the school, and she had made arrangements with Mrs. Holt's niece, a young woman named Bet, to come to the house each morning and mind James until Susanna returned in the afternoon. This arrangement worked well, and James appeared to regard Bet with the tolerant acceptance of an infant who knew he had options. Luke officially ended his arrangement with Douglas Kane in the spring of the following year, as they had planned. He gave Kane proper notice, helped him hire and train a replacement, and finished his last week at the Double C on a Friday afternoon with a handshake from Douglas Kane that turned briefly into something more like an embrace, which both of them resolved never to speak of. "You have done well," Kane said. "I had a good employer," Luke said. "You had a good wife," Kane said, which was both accurate and a deflection of the compliment, and was therefore perfect Douglas Kane. With his full attention now on his own land, Luke worked with the focused energy of a man building towards something visible. He expanded his horse breeding operation, which was already developing a reputation in the county for good stock. He put in a second field of wheat and established a kitchen garden that was, by the second year, as productive as Susanna's original effort, which pleased her in a way she expressed through very precise and specific praise about the irrigation work. He built a proper barn and a tack room and a small bunkhouse for the seasonal hand he hired when the work required it. And through all of it, every morning, he drove Susanna to the schoolhouse in Caldwell, and every afternoon he brought her home, because that was the shape of their days and the shape suited them both. James grew. At 2, he was running. At 3, he was everywhere he should not be. By 4, he had developed very specific opinions about horses, which his father encouraged, and his mother monitored with the watchful eye of a woman who understood perfectly well that enthusiasm and safety were not always the same thing. Luke put James on the back of a small gentle mare named Penny at 4 years old, the same age he himself had first sat a horse, and held the lead rope while James sat very straight with his small face absolutely serious, and Susanna stood at the corral fence watching with her arms folded and her expression neutral, which he had learned to read as containing a great deal of feeling that she had decided not to put in the way of. "He is fine," Luke said, walking the mare around the corral. "I know," Susanna said. "He has good balance," Luke said. "He does," she said. "You can stop watching like you are waiting for something to fall," he said. "I will watch exactly as much as I choose," she said, and there was the voice that had spoken up on a train platform in 1882 and changed everything. James looked over at his mother from the back of the mare and said, very seriously, "I am doing it, Mama." "You are doing beautifully," she said, and her voice was entirely warm. In the autumn of 1886, Susanna told Luke she was expecting their second child, with the same direct morning announcement over coffee that she had used the first time. Luke's response was quicker this time, because he had learned what to do with this particular news. He came around the table immediately and held her, and she put her face against his neck, and they stayed like that for a long moment while the October morning came through the kitchen windows, and James, who was now 4 and had no patience for slow breakfasts, said loudly from his chair that he was still hungry. "In a moment," Luke said, not letting go. "Your father and I are having a moment," Susanna said, muffled. "A long one," James observed. They separated, laughing, and breakfast continued, and later that day after James was in bed, Luke and Susanna sat by the fire with the quiet of the house around them, and he held her hand and they talked about what was coming, all of it, the practical and the hopeful and the uncertain, with the complete ease of two people who had learned each other thoroughly and liked what they knew. "I would like a daughter," Susanna said. "What if it is a boy?" Luke said. "Then I will love him every bit as much," she said. "I just have a feeling." The second child was born in May of 1887, a girl, arriving with considerably less noise than her brother had, but making herself felt immediately through a quality of focused attentiveness in her dark eyes that Susanna recognized with a feeling of joyful inevitability. "Hello," Susanna said, when the baby was first placed in her arms. "I thought it was you." They named her Margaret after Luke's mother. James, who was 5 and had been informed he was getting a sibling with varying degrees of enthusiasm depending on the day, arrived at the side of his mother's bed and looked at Margaret for a long time with serious green eyes. "She is small," he said. "You were small too," Luke said. "I do not remember that," James said with dignity. He adapted quickly, which was characteristic. By the following month he was bringing Margaret things she could not possibly want yet, but which he considered appropriate gifts, including his best piece of string and a pebble he considered unusually shaped. Susanna kept the pebble on the kitchen windowsill, which James noticed and was clearly pleased by, and did not comment on it because he did not want to be seen being pleased. The ranch grew steadily. Luke's horses were known across 3 counties by 1888, and he had 4 regular buyers, including a cavalry unit that placed an order annually for remounts. He had hired a permanent hand, a quiet and capable young man named Carl, who had come up from the trail and was glad to have steady work and a proper bunk. The land was producing well. The debt to Douglas Kane was paid in full by 1887, and the section that had been raw grassland when Luke had ridden it with Susanna in the summer of 1882 was now a working ranch with a real house and a real barn and horses in the pasture that any man in the county would have been glad to own. Susanna had been teaching for 6 years by the time Margaret was born, and she had by this point shaped the education of somewhere near 100 children in Caldwell's growing school. Some of her earliest students were nearly grown. She had fought, through the school board and through patient written correspondence with the county superintendent, for better reading materials, for proper slates for every student, and for the right to include history and geography in the standard curriculum rather than confining herself to arithmetic and reading, which was what the board had originally specified. She had won most of these arguments, which the board had come to accept as the natural outcome of arguing with Susanna Mercer Graves. They had also come to acknowledge that the school's reputation, which drew families to settle in the county with the specific knowledge that their children would receive a proper education, was directly connected to the quality and conviction of its teacher. On an afternoon in October of 1888, 6 years after the train had pulled into Caldwell Station, Luke drove the wagon to the schoolhouse at the usual time and sat in the seat, while Susanna came out with 2 of her older students who wanted to ask her something, and she answered them standing by the wagon wheel with her teaching bag over her arm, patient and precise, and then climbed up beside him. James was at the ranch with Carl, being taught to help with evening feed, and Margaret was at the house with Bet, who had become by this point more or less a permanent member of the household's constellation. They drove east toward the land in the autumn afternoon, the sky going rose and amber on the horizon, and Susanna had her head slightly back watching the light, and Luke drove without hurrying. "Do you know what today is?" she said. "Tell me," he said. "It is the 6th anniversary of the train arriving in Caldwell," she said, "to the week." Luke thought about that May afternoon, the heat of the platform, the woman at the top of the iron steps announcing that the view was considerably worse than advertised. "So it is," he said. "I have been thinking about that," she said, "about what I expected and what I got instead." And she turned to look at him. The light was golden on her face, on the chestnut hair that had a few threads of gray in it now that she wore with the same composure she wore everything. The sharp gray eyes were warm in the way they only got in private, in the quiet spaces they had built together. "I got better," she said, "considerably." He looked at her for a long moment and then returned his attention to the road, but he was smiling and she knew it. "I got better too," he said. "The advertised version of my life," she said, "was a respectable household arrangement with a rancher who wanted a capable woman to manage things. The reality was," she gestured toward the horizon, toward where their land was, where their house was, where their children were. "Worse than expected," he suggested. "Do not be irritating," she said fondly. He laughed. He reached over and took her hand off her lap and held it, the way he had in the wagon 6 years ago when she had put her hand over his on the reins, and she turned her hand and held his back. "Luke," she said, "I want you to know something," she said, "in case I do not say it as clearly as I mean to sometimes." "You always say things clearly," he said. I mean as clearly as I feel it, she amended. This life, what we have built. I would not change a single piece of it. Not the dead gardens in Caldwell, and not Hector Prout walking away, and not even the train ride from St. Louis, with all my books making the trunk too heavy. I would not change it because it brought me to that platform and kept you there and brought me here, and here is exactly where I am supposed to be. The prairie opened out around them in the falling light, broad and golden and going to purple at the edges, the sky enormous above and the land enormous below, and their life placed in the center of all of it like something carefully and rightly situated. Susanna, he said, and his voice had that roughness it sometimes got when he meant something fully. I know, she said, I know. He brought the wagon around the last rise, and their house came into view in the evening light, lit at the kitchen window, smoke at the chimney, the horses moving quietly in the pasture, the barn standing solid against the darkening sky. From inside, faintly, they could hear Carl's voice and James's higher one in response, some argument about the proper way to store feed sacks that they had apparently already been having. Margaret would be awake in the house, probably pulling herself upright on the furniture, which was a new and determined project of hers. Susanna looked at the house for a moment as they came down toward it, the way she always did, with the look of a person accounting for what she had and finding it more than sufficient. Home, she said quietly. Home, Luke agreed. They came down from the wagon in the Kansas dusk, and Susanna went up the porch steps and through the door into the lit warmth of the kitchen, and Luke led the horses to the barn and brushed them down and watered them. And Cutter, who was 14 now and had been everywhere with him, turned and pressed his nose briefly to Luke's shoulder in that comfortable, familiar way of old horses with their people, and Luke rubbed the old gelding's ear. We did all right, he said to the horse, to the barn, to the Kansas night closing down soft and dark around the lighted house. James came to the barn door with a lantern. Mama says supper is ready, he said. Carl got mud on the feed sacks and I told him not to. You were right, Luke said, hanging the brush. James considered this with satisfaction. I know, he said. They walked back to the house together, father and son, across the short distance of the yard, the lantern throwing warm light on the grass, and through the kitchen window Susanna was moving, setting the table, and Margaret was on her hip, looking out at the dark yard with those watchful eyes, and the house was full of light and the smell of supper and the noise of people who belonged to each other. The years continued, and they were good years. James grew into a rangy, serious boy who had his father's eye for horses and his mother's capacity for noticing things precisely and saying them clearly, which made him excellent at school and occasionally challenging at supper. Susanna taught him at home on top of his schooling, the way her own father had taught her, reading to him in the evenings from the books in the trunk, history and natural philosophy and poetry, and he absorbed it all with the focused appetite of a child whose mind was built for more than it was being given. Margaret grew into a bright and curious girl with her mother's directness and her father's steady patience, a combination that made her simultaneously the easiest and the most interesting child to talk to. She loved the horses with the same instinctive ease James did, and by the time she was 4, she was following Luke around the pasture on her small, determined legs, handing him things when he worked and asking questions at a rate that required full adult concentration to answer properly. In the fall of 1890, when James was 8 and Margaret was 3, a third child arrived, another boy born in November, whom they named Thomas after Douglas Kane's father, because Douglas Kane had been the kind of man in their lives who deserved that. And when Luke told him, Kane nodded once and cleared his throat and found something to look at on the other side of the room and then recovered, and said Thomas was a fine name, and they should bring the boy out to the Double C as soon as the weather allowed. Thomas was quieter than either of his siblings had been, which was a distinction that required no special effort to maintain, and he had Luke's green eyes and a placid, observant quality that made Susanna say he was perhaps taking after her father, who had also been a quiet man who watched and understood. He slept better than the other two had, which Susanna regarded with frank relief and gratitude. The ranch was fully self-sustaining by this point. Luke's horse breeding reputation had spread well beyond the county, and he had corresponded with buyers as far as Colorado and New Mexico, and the work was steady and good. Carl had stayed on as a permanent hand and was by now as much a part of the place as the barn itself. Bet had married a carpenter named Hollies and moved to a house in Caldwell, but she still came out on Tuesdays and Thursdays to help with the children, which suited everyone. Douglas Kane came to supper on a Sunday in the winter of 1891, and he was thinner than he had been and moved more slowly. And Susanna noticed it immediately and arranged the table so he had the most comfortable chair nearest the fire. And Luke noticed she had done this, and loved her for it in the quiet way. He loved the 100 small, competent kindnesses she performed every day without ceremony. Kane ate well and played with the children after supper, which he did with the slightly rusty patience of a man who had not spent much time with small people, but was willing to learn. And James showed him the horse he had been assigned to help care for, a chestnut yearling named Patch, with the pride of a boy who had something real to be proud of, and Kane gave his opinion of the horse with the seriousness it deserved. Driving him back to the Double C at the end of the evening, Luke and Susanna sat together on the wagon seat in the cold, clear night. "He is not well," Susanna said when they were out of earshot of the house. "I know," Luke said. "He is managing it without complaint," she said. "That is Douglas. We should have him more often," she said, "not less. Some people become private when they are unwell and make the mistake of being alone about it." Luke looked at her. "Yes," he said, "you are right. They had him to supper twice a month through that winter and spring, and he came without being pressed about it, which told them what they needed to know about how he received the invitation. He passed in the summer of 1892, quietly, at his ranch, of the same thing that had been taking his strength for 2 years. His foreman sent word, and Luke sat at the kitchen table with the news for a long time, and Susanna sat across from him, and did not say anything empty or consoling but reached across the table and held his hands, and that was what was needed. The Double C passed to Douglas Kane's nephew, a young man from Ohio who came out to assess the situation, and after some months decided to sell rather than run it. Luke put in an offer on 2 adjacent parcels that added to his own section, and the purchase was negotiated and completed. The land that had been the Double C's eastern range was now part of the Graves spread, which brought the total acreage to something that would have been difficult to imagine standing on the train platform in 1882, watching a woman with a carpet bag and a trunk full of books announce her disappointment to the afternoon. Life moved through its seasons with the rhythm of working land and growing children, and Susanna continued to teach. She taught for many more years, long enough to have some of James's schoolmates' children in her classroom eventually, long enough to be known in the county as the best teacher it had produced and perhaps would produce. She fought for things consistently and won most of them, because she was patient and specific and never asked for more than was right, and people who made the mistake of underestimating her sharpness on account of the warmth she also carried eventually learned better. James grew up to work the ranch with Luke, taking to it with the natural aptitude of a young man who had grown up watching every part of it. He was 20 years old in 1902, tall and direct and good with horses in the way his father had always been, and he had an eye for land and a head for the business side that made Luke proud in the deep, uncomplicated way of a father watching a son become himself. Margaret grew up to have opinions about everything and the capacity to act on them, which her parents had always expected and encouraged. She studied from every book on the shelves and several that she wrote to the Caldwell library to obtain, and she was the kind of young woman who read widely and thought clearly and spoke precisely, and who attracted the attention of a young man named Edward Hartley, a geological surveyor who came through the county in 1903 on a government contract, and stayed several months longer than the contract required. Thomas, the quiet one, went to Kansas City at 18 to study medicine, which surprised no one who had watched how carefully he attended to things. He wrote long letters home, and Susanna wrote back letters that were models of their kind, full of the detail and wit of a woman who had always loved the written word and kept all her faculties sharp. In the autumn of 1904, 22 years after Susanna had stepped off the train at Caldwell, Kansas, and announced to the assembled afternoon that things were considerably worse than advertised, Luke and Susanna Graves sat on the porch of their house in the early evening light. The porch had been added 6 years after the house was built, with a good railing and 2 proper chairs, and a view east to where the cottonwoods along the creek had grown tall, and the pasture grass moved in the perpetual Kansas wind. James was in the barn with Carl, who was grayer now but still steady. Margaret was inside writing a letter to Edward Hartley, who had gone back to Kansas City and was corresponding with very evident purpose. Thomas's last letter was on the kitchen table, full of the interesting particulars of what he was learning. Susanna had her knitting, which she had learned in her 3rd year on the ranch from Mrs. Holt and had subsequently applied to with characteristic thoroughness. Luke had his coffee. The evening was clear and still, and the sky was doing what Kansas skies did in autumn, going colors that had no name, and the land spread out around the house in the deep familiar way of land that knows it is home. "Luke," she said, "what are you thinking about?" He thought about it honestly, which was the only way he knew to think. "A train platform," he said. "May of '82. She set down her knitting. "Ah," she said. "What about it?" "I was supposed to walk past," he said. "I had an errand. I was supposed to collect a saddle bag and go to the general store and get back to the Double C before dark. I was completely on my way somewhere else. And then you stopped," she said. "And then I stopped," he said. She looked out at the evening. "What made you stop?" He considered it the real answer, the one he had never put into precise words. "You said exactly what you thought," he said, "right there on the platform in front of everyone. You said what you saw and what you felt, and you did not perform anything or pretend anything. I had not heard anyone do that in a long time. Maybe not exactly like that." He was quiet a moment. "I wanted to hear more." She was looking at him now in the sideways way she had when something had reached her. "You stayed to hear more," she said. "I stayed," he said, "and then I kept staying. Because of a comment about dead gardens," she said. "Because of you," he said. "The gardens were just the beginning." She reached over and took his hand where it rested on the arm of his chair, and he turned his hand and held hers, and they sat together in the settling evening, the way they had been sitting together for 22 years, in wagons and at tables and on this porch. And the world went on around them with all its ordinary, extraordinary business. The horses in the pasture and the cottonwoods in the creek, and the stars beginning to come out one by one above the enormous Kansas sky. "Considerably better than advertised," Susanna said, "to the evening, to the land, to all of it. For both of us," Luke said. She squeezed his hand once, brief and certain, and went back to her knitting, and he went back to his coffee, and the stars kept coming, and the house behind them was lit and warm, and the land went all the way to the horizon in every direction, and everything that had ever needed to be built had been built, and everything that had ever needed to be said had been said, and they were exactly where they had always been going together, in the wild and open and entirely sufficient country of their own full life.